Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mark Dirks, and on behalf of ACRL in Choice, I'd like to welcome you to today's program, Primary Sources in Teaching, Collaborations Between Libraries and Faculty, which is sponsored by Adam Matthew. Today's discussion is one in a series of sponsored webinars from ACRL in Choice that addresses new ideas, developments, and products of interest to the academic library community. Free to users, these structured 60-minute live presentations provide the opportunity for interactive discussions of important new issues and developments in academic librarianship by librarians, vendors, authors, and other interested stakeholders. Before we get started, I'd like to point out a few features of the webinar software. In the main area of the screen, you should be able to follow along with the presentation materials. Along the right-hand side, you'll see a Q&A panel and a chat panel. If you don't, you can click the buttons labeled Chat and Q&A in the upper right corner of the screen to activate the panels. Please use the Q&A panel to submit questions to our speakers, and at the end of the presentation, they'll take a few minutes to answer those, so please do send your questions in throughout. If you experience any technical issues, please use the chat box to let me know that, and I will troubleshoot that issue with you privately. Today, we're using the hashtag ACRL Choice Webinars during the event, so if you have another screen handy, shout out to us. We're at choice_reviews on Twitter. Also note that we are recording today's program and that everyone who registered should receive a follow-up email with a link to the archived version. And here to introduce our speakers today is Ben Lacey from Adam Matthew. So I will turn the floor over to you, Ben.
Thanks very much, Mark. First of all, can I just check? I've turned up my mic. Is it any better? Because I've seen in the Q&A a few people mentioning the sound.
It's better.
It definitely sounds good.
I'm really sorry for that, guys. Yeah, I'm pleased that it's working now. So just to introduce today's session, first of all, thanks to Mark and Choice for putting this on. I'm just going to go to the agenda first of all. So I'm going to start by introducing the speakers, and then I will say a very brief word about who Adam Matthew are and the collections that will be mentioned today. But then we'll get into the main session, and the idea is to have a discussion with each of our speakers about putting primary source research at the heart of the undergraduate experience. And this is going to be focused on digital material, but I'm hoping that we get to touch on the physical archives as well, and the way they can be used together. So the way we've set this up is to have speakers that represent the teaching faculty, students, and librarian communities, the idea being to show how important it is for all people to work together in this area. And then what we'll do at the end is finish with some of your questions. One note on this, Dr. Malik has he has to leave a little early today because of teaching commitments. So we'll take questions to him after the first section, and then the other questions we'll save to the end. So that's our agenda. To introduce the speakers. So our first speaker is Dr. Malik, who is a lecturer in World History, International Studies, and Development Studies at the University of Iowa. He teaches on a variety of courses, including History Matters, the Russian Revolution of 1917, and that's what he'll be talking about today. His book, Rethinking the Industrial Revolution, explores 5 centuries of English and British history and is part of a broader effort to understand the nature and origins of capitalism. He received his PhD in political science from York University in Toronto, and he's also done a lot of work in the humanitarian sphere, as well as in academia. We then have Kelsey Waters. She's a senior at California State University at Fullerton. She's now in her final semester of undergraduate studies, and she's actually taking a pilot course that extends the senior capstone research project from 1 semester into 2 semesters. This extension is designed to allow for greater depth to the project and a better understanding of the historiography and methodology that underpins it. Her research itself is focused on nursing and the role of women in medicine and the military during the revolutionary period. And finally, we have Dr. George Oberl, who is both history librarian and a member of the teaching faculty at George Mason University, where he also completed his PhD in history. His dissertation studies the impact of the information revolution in the 18th and 19th centuries and for the development of the early republic in the United States. He currently serves as the history librarian at George Mason University, and it's in this role that he's helped faculty members to integrate online primary sources into their teaching, most notably helping to build a new program for history majors that focuses on research skills and using primary source material. So finally, there's me. Just to say, my role at Adam Matthew is to help people with access to our digital primary source collections get the most out of them. And that involves things like running training sessions and workshops, but also providing guides that help librarians, lecturers, and students find the most useful material and to navigate the site successfully. In today's session, my main function is going to be to ask a few questions that will facilitate the presenters that will actually be talking about their experience. So that's your speakers. Before we get into the main session, a very quick word on Adam Matthew. So the company publishes digital primary source collections for the humanities and social sciences. We're based in the UK, but we actually work with libraries and archives all over the world. And originally we were a microfilm company, but since 2005 it's been solely digital products. The company is actually now an independent subsidiary of Sage, and we publish about 10 new collections each year. Now, each of our speakers has experience working with one or more Adam Matthew collections, so together with other primary source material as well, that is. As a very quick overview, I don't want to kind of get bogged down in them explaining what the collections are, so I thought I'd just do a really quick overview of the things that you're going to hear about today. We've got Socialism on Film, which contains digital copies of film reels housed at the British Film Institute. These were actually made in communist countries during the 20th century and were brought to the UK by a British communist who also versioned most of them into English. The second collection we'll hear about is Colonial America, which is the complete digital version of the CO5 records. They're the British government's correspondence from 1606 to 1822 relating to its North American colonies. American History is the next one up. It's the digital version of the Gilder Lehrman collection, some of you might be familiar with. All of them in that collection are documents relating to the history of America. So items range from soldiers' letters during the Civil War all the way to early drafts of the Constitution and running up to Second World War material as well. Then we have Market Research in American Business. This contains the papers of Ernest Dichter, who was one of the pioneers of market research and motivational research in the 20th century. And finally, Popular Culture in Britain and America, which contains documents relating to society, culture, and politics in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. That's a very quick overview. If you want to find out any more, you can visit the Adam Matthew website, and there's more details on all of those collections available there. What we're going to do today, though, is start off by thinking about the faculty experience when it comes to teaching with primary sources. And for this, I'd like to introduce Dr. Malik. He was teaching on the Russian Revolution last semester, and as part of this, he used material from Socialism on Film. So, hello, Mike.
Hey, Ben.
Hi. I thought we'd start off today, if it's okay, with you giving a little bit of background to the course and maybe saying something about how the History Matters course came about.
So at the University of Iowa History Department, they have a couple of series. History Matters is one of those series for organizing general education courses. General education courses are overseen by the General Education Committee, which sets out a series of guidelines. And then courses are usually offered at the first-year level to students in general at the university. And so one thing that happens is these courses fill up right away because students have to meet a certain number of general education requirements for their degree. And so these courses then tend to attract a large range of students. So it's a good opportunity for the department to reach a broader audience outside of the history majors. And this particular title, History Matters, is a new title just in the last year, and it's generated a lot of excitement.
That's really interesting. So, so this is something that people from outside of history majors take. So you get quite a broad range of subject matter in here, do you? or people taking a broad range of subjects?
Yeah, I actually had 30 courses, 30 students in the class, and no history majors. But what was really stunning about this class is I had a really special group of students who were just, just riveted to the material. Really came with a strong interest in the topic, and so it was really quite extraordinary to have a classroom with no history majors, but with students who were very deeply engaged in the history, actually.
Yeah, fantastic. That does sound really good. So within that, you used some of the films from the Socialism on Film collection. Can you say a bit about where they fitted in and how you actually used them?
Well, I used them, scattered them throughout the semester. Now, this is the first time I've had somebody working with an organization like Adam Matthew and a digital archives collection reach out to me. So when I heard from you, Ben, about socialism and film and the availability of all of these primary source video footage clips, I was very excited. But it was, I had to kind of scramble to figure out where I was going to work them in. So it was a supplement to the main thing which I do, which is lecture from the readings and from my supplemental readings. And I also try to work with a lot of, as you'll see in my slides, a lot of primary source images that just helps students put pictures to the material. But the films were a great addition to the class because we're talking along during this time period, and it's one thing to kind of lecture and kind of do it all in a cerebral exercise, but it's quite another thing to be able to see people moving on the streets, to see famous figures captured on film, to see dramatizations of major events. All of that added a degree of quality to the class that would have been lacking if Ben had not reached out to me.
Fantastic. Yeah, just a little bit of background there. Like I said, one of my roles here is to kind of support institutions that have access to our material. So Socialism on Film was something that I already had, and one of the reasons I reached out to Mike is because I knew that he was teaching this course and I thought it might be helpful for him. Now, the next few slides, Mike, are about the class generally. So are you okay to talk them through, and I'll click through the slides as and when you want me to move on. So we'll just move on to the first one here.
Yeah, so what you see here is a slide I created, for my lecture. And this is a clip, a takeout from a film that's available on Socialism Film, and it's the coronation of Nicholas II in 1896, which is one of the kind of major events, preceding the Russian Revolution of 1917 that sets it up. But what's stunning about the film is that that you see the way in which the Tsar was trying to kind of create a fairy book tale kind of pageantry and parade to the whole event. For students to be able to see that and kind of experience it visually really kind of brings it home to a sense of a very real thing. And of course, we had talked about all the controversies surrounding Nicholas II's coronation, where there was violence involved in the coronation, and his character as a leader who really didn't have strong skills. That actually is one of the major factors leading to the revolution. And of course, just the personal family drama that unfolds behind the scenes. So that was a really good start in terms of helping students, feel like they're in touch with the actual time period and get their minds into it.
Yeah.
Let me move on to the next one. So another thing that was available in the Socialism Film was not actual footage from the time period, but a lot of films, including propaganda films made by the Soviet government, but also a couple of films that we looked at that were kind of reconstructions of the event of the revolution. And of course, the sort of climactic event was Lenin, walking into the hall, and announcing that the revolution had been complete. And there were several reenactments of this, which were also quite useful for us to look at and discuss. For example, notably absent in the films is the figure of Trotsky, who of course would have been present there in real life at the time. But when Trotsky fell out of favor with Stalin's government, he was sort of excised from the official, dramatizations. So there's a lot to take apart in those dramatizations, as well as the actual historical footage. And one more. You want to move on?
Yeah. One more.
So we then moved from the revolution itself to the Civil War and after. And of course, during and after the Civil War, which is a really tragic story, which I think all of us taking the course, I think, felt that there's so much more to talk about. There's so much more to uncover in this story. But one of the key figures is Felix Dzerzhinsky, shown here, who was tasked with creating a secret police force to deal with potential enemies of the regime. And who then, puts in motion the Cheka, which was engaged in, enormous violence and killing of people accused or convicted of being, enemies of the state or enemies of the regime. And it was quite stunning to see a film available in the archive collection, where I believe this is the 1940s or 1950s, where they're holding a parade in Dzerzhinsky's honor, commemorating his great work. And this was really striking for the students to be able to see that. And it would have been hard for me to go elsewhere and find something that helps us kind of get a window into this major part of the story, the way that the film did.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I think it kind of leads me on to my follow-up question, which was going to be, how did the students react or respond to the films and the footage that they were seeing?
Well, I think we discussed it. It really helped bring the narratives to life. And they were very much engaged, when we would watch the films. They were kind of meditative, but very much engaged. And I think it helped raise the overall level of engagement in the classroom, which was very high, and I was very pleased with. I had one student who had a family connection to some of the events described in the class, and so that student really, seemed to connect directly to the material. But all the students got a lot out of the class, and I think they all came away from the class in general, but again, the films were a great help, realizing that the Russian Revolution was a far more complex event than they had thought coming into the class. And I think they all felt very good about themselves, leaving with that knowledge, because now they can go out and talk to others about this event knowledgeably and with a much clearer sense of what all was involved.
Yeah. That's kind of jumped ahead to my next question as well, which was about how they responded to the course more generally. So is that the main takeaway that you got from it, that maybe seeing primary source documents rather than secondary literature helped the students to see the events in a different way and maybe treat them as more of a reality than they otherwise would have done?
Well, one of the things I did in the class is gave a primary source assignment. But when I sort of wrote up the draft for the assignment before I was aware of the film series, and so it wasn't really tailored towards looking at the films. Although I think I did tell them that was an option for them. So we do some work with primary sources regardless. But I think film is particularly valuable. Because sometimes, when a student goes out and finds a document or an image, it requires them to do kind of a lot of extra work, and it's not necessarily self-explanatory. So if I teach this course again, and I'm thinking about doing it in January, I'm probably going to try to, get them, get their hands dirty directly in looking at this archive, and maybe even have a primary source assignment specifically asking them to choose a film, watch it, react to it, and so forth. You sort of evaluate it and talk about the context, because I feel like it's extremely valuable way for them to get engaged in the material.
Yeah, for sure. I've actually this is off topic, but actually maybe some of the attendees might be interested as well. I've got some examples of film analysis that's been done as well, so I'm happy to share those as well if anyone wants to get in touch, and the same with you, Mike, afterwards. That kind of covers my next question, so I'm going to skip over that. And I'm also going to go back to that point you made about other types of sources. Now, I know when we've spoken before, you've mentioned courses at Iowa that use local archives and special collections at the university library as well. Are you able to say any more about that, or about the other types of primary sources that students are encouraged to use, either in your class or in colleagues' classes that run at Iowa?
Well, the classes at the department I'm aware of, like Glenn Penny is working on a project where he gets students looking at Germans in early Iowa history, and so they have a state historical library on campus here. And he gets them, going to the archives and gets them very excited about looking at, reading about, say, First World War letters of family members writing back from the front or what have you. And also, a lot of propaganda around, that was targeting Germans in Iowa at that time, so that they were kind of a, somewhat persecuted group. I've thought of, since I have Czech heritage, I've thought about doing something similar in terms of early, Czechs in Iowa history. But I think the challenge for a class like this is that it's a broad class, and of course there's no direct. I'm sure there were a few Russians in Iowa back at the time, but there's no real direct connection to the events in terms of local archives. So that's why this archive was so valuable to me, and that's why I'm going to keep my eye out for more archives like it, so that I can direct my students in that direction. But in terms of the assignment I did give them, I was kind of relying on them to find out where to go for archives. I did give them a few sort of very broad general archive links, but I didn't sort of supervise how they negotiated that material.
Yeah, and they got on okay with that.
Yeah, they did well.
That's great.
Well, yeah.
That's great. Well, that's been fantastic. Thanks very much for that overview and that look at the way that you've integrated primary sources of various types into your teaching. If anybody does have any questions for Mike, please do put them in the Q&A. So we do have one that's just come in, actually. So, Mike, did you collaborate with the archivist in any way for the use of these materials, or for instruction for primary and archival source literacy? And if so, would you be able to speak a little more about it?
Well, I guess I'm ashamed to say I didn't reach out to the historian. I wrote it here on my notes that I'm writing to myself, that I need to reach out to the history librarian at the university to work more closely in future. But I guess I was leaning on Ben pretty heavily because we had, a running dialogue about these films. And part of the problem was this was my first time teaching the class, and for anyone who's ever prepped a class, what that can be like, just trying to kind of scramble to come up with the material for class each day. And so I pulled a lot of all-nighters, before class for this class, and so next time around, I do intend to do that, and get familiarize myself more with what's directly available here on campus, or what students can do in terms of working with the librarians.
Yeah.
In the past, I've struggled, to get my students interested in working with the librarians. When I've made that suggestion in various classes. As you probably know, students are very online focused these days. If they can sit in their apartment and look things up, they're going to do that before they set foot in a library, unfortunately. So I think we have an uphill battle in terms of making students aware of how much support is available for them at the libraries.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's very true. And actually, with that in mind, one of the there's quite a few questions coming in now, but one of the questions is about building e-links or other access points into course packs or learning management tools. Is that something that you did for this course? So did you build links into a course pack, or did you just encourage students to go and search the library resources for themselves?
Well, I gave them some links to some archives in the handout for the assignment, but if you're asking about reading materials, I also produced a reader for the class that they had to purchase, which pulled together all the articles that we're reading, and there was one textbook for the class as well.
Okay. And then another question. In your experience, do undergraduates without foreign languages have difficulty handling primary sources? And did you limit the primary sources you suggested to English language ones? If not, what strategies did you have in dealing with non-English materials?
That's a good question. I think in terms of the document, the textual primary sources that students worked with, they were working with translations in English. So I didn't have anyone report back saying, I was looking for something, but it was only available in Russian or Ukrainian. But that's something, that I guess I should keep in mind in future. These are first-year students, and so, I think to expect them to, take that extra step when they're taking a gen ed course, which is kind of like, something they may have thought of taking at last moment, is maybe a bit too, bit more than one would hope for. In other classes, other history classes, I have had students who did engage in, working with materials in other languages, but that's because they spoke that language or they were studying that language.
Okay.
But there is also a strong preference for just working with an image or two, and putting together some images as their primary source assignment, and then there's no question of interpretation.
Yeah. And then when it comes to that assignment and that assessment, and looking at how students fared with using the primary sources, in your opinion, did they think critically about them? Did they seem excited about them? And perhaps this bit really stuck out at me from this question. Did they develop new ideas about the topic that you had never thought of?
That happens sometimes, definitely. I mean, usually the exciting thing about having students go out and find primary sources is precisely that, I'm often unfamiliar with the primary source in question. So I do definitely learn things from them. Sorry, back up. The question before that was?
And then how did they fare with actually using them? Did they think critically about them, and did they seem excited about working with them?
Well, it's always a challenge, right? I mean, you get a range. You get students who really demonstrate a keen interest and strong knowledge, and really are able to apply the context of the class itself to the assignment. And then you get the students who are, see this as maybe a really easy way to, do an assignment because all they have to do is go grab an image and talk about it for 5 minutes or something.
Okay.
And they're not really applying, that critical perspective. So it's a challenge to get them to think critically. But generally, I've been, happy with the results, and I think the students also, when I have them do presentations, I think they really enjoy sharing and learning from each other.
Yeah, that's great to hear. That's really good to hear. And I'm going to round up some of the questions now, because we do need to move on to our other speakers. And actually, this is a really good point to move on to our next speaker, because we're talking about putting students at the center of developing new ideas about a topic. And our next speaker is going to talk about the student experience of using primary source materials. So our next speaker, well, first of all, thanks very much to Mike. Thank you so much for covering that and introducing us to that and answering those questions. And
My
then
pleasure.
our next,
thanks for having me.
Thank you. Thanks. And then our next speaker is Kelsey. So she's going to be talking about primary sources from a student's point of view. There were actually two collections she used, Colonial America and American History. And so, hi, Kelsey.
Hi.
Hi. I thought we'd start off with a similar question to the one that Mike covered first. So what was the subject of the class in which you used, to start with, Colonial America?
Right. So that class that I mainly used Colonial America in was for my historical writing course, which is basically a foundational level course that every history major at Cal State Fullerton is required to take. And it's designed to teach students how to write an academic paper. So the theme for my historical writing course was actually colonial America, and the paper that I was working on focused on disease and colonial medicine and health, so this database was actually perfect for my research purposes. And actually the sources that I found for that paper using the Colonial America database were a big inspiration for my research project for my senior capstone, because I enjoyed working with those types of sources so much that I actually wanted to take that research a step further.
Okay. And in terms of how you were first introduced to the database, how was it introduced to you, and how much instruction were you given initially with that database?
Yeah, so this database was actually the first primary source database that I had ever used, so it was completely new to me and most of my class. So my professor for the historical writing course introduced our class to the database, and she loves it because it's extremely user-friendly. So she was using it to show our class how to find the primary sources to use in our independent research, and we were assigned to use the database to find the primary source that we found interesting, and then to transcribe it and to bring the transcription to class. So this actually helped us become more familiar with primary sources in multiple ways, and it was actually really fun.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Just to go off on a side tangent for a second, how did you actually find the transcription, like the first transcription that you undertook?
Well, I was looking at letters, so our assignment was to find the source, and then we had to physically write it down on a piece of paper, so we were doing the transcriptions ourselves. So
yeah.
there were no transcriptions available. And it was kind of designed to like teach us how to read the handwriting from the past, you know, because it can be kind of difficult with different characters that were used that aren't used in writing today.
Yeah, I think that's such a good idea for introducing these documents, whether they're online or even in a physical archive as well. Now, I know you were going to talk a little bit about the work that you've then undertaken using these documents. So I think, first of all, you were going to say a few words about the project that you did whilst you were taking that historical writing course. So are you okay to talk us through the research that you did for that?
Yeah, so the title of the paper that I wrote for the historical writing course was Smallpox in Colonial America, Re-examining the Colonial Understanding of Contagion. So in this project, I started out looking at depopulation of Native Americans due to smallpox, and kind of it was inspired a little bit about like the debate surrounding whether or not General Amherst ordered the distributions of smallpox blankets to Native Americans, and whether or not that was intentionally done. But instead of focusing on that debate specifically, I kind of saw an opportunity to explore the depths of which the colonists understood the concepts and methods of contagion. So in this project, I really depended a lot on legislation. It was a really big factor because it showed to me how colonists responded to the outbreaks. So this example here was an act providing in case of sickness, and it was an act passed in New Hampshire in 1714 that basically outlines a system of health care that was set up to care for the sick. So it establishes that separate housing would be provided for people who had smallpox, as well as providing nurses to tend to them. And what's actually really significant about this source is that towns were responsible for paying the expenses of the treatments for their sick people, even if they received treatments for their disease or their illness in another town. So this, to me, served as evidence that the colonists understood that providing treatment for all people, especially the poor, were essential to like maintaining public health, and sort of showed me that they understood that without the availability of treatments for people who couldn't afford to pay for it themselves, that they knew that smallpox would have continued to spread.
That's really interesting. It sounds like a fascinating project. And you actually stuck with a medical theme for your capstone project as well, didn't you? Because you're looking at
Yes.
nurses in the American Revolution. So just as a point of context, this is actually the American history material now that's being looked at rather than the colonial America. The database functions in much the same way, I think, maybe ever so slightly different, but again, the idea is it's a single archive and it's their collection digitized.
Exactly.
So yeah, please, any information on the research that you've been undertaking for that would be great as well.
Yes, so for this project, we've just finished the drafting stage, so I'm still currently working on this research and writing this paper. But my title for this paper is Beyond the Domestic Sphere, Nurses in the American Revolution. So I'm looking at sort of traditional gender roles and how women were able to break out of them by acting as nurses in the American Revolution. So in this paper, my research has really been focused for primary sources on using newspapers and financial documents. So this source right here is actually an ad that was placed in the New England Chronicle. This specific ad was posted in March of 1776, although I have found this exact ad in several other newspapers throughout the colonies at different dates, which shows me that these newspaper ads were used as like a popular method for recruitment of nurses, and that it wasn't just a regional practice, it was widespread practice. But the most significant part about this source that I love, I jumped for joy when I read this line, was that it says, it's calling for women to serve as nurses and some men laborers to assist the nurses, which I found most significant because it actually, for the first time that I have seen, places women in a position of superiority above men, and it shows that they were mentally capable and professional in this field enough to serve as a sort of supervisory role.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and again, it sounds just like amazing research that you're doing, and it's really impressive to see this sort of research being done at an undergraduate level as well. No, it really is, and I'm really impressed with everything that kind of the people in your class were doing as well. Again, for some background for the audience, I was lucky enough to get to meet some of the people undertaking these classes. And actually that leads me on to my follow-up question, which was, as an undergraduate, how have you and your peers found working with primary sources, especially maybe those 18th century documents that I guess a lot of people would consider to be quite challenging for undergraduate students?
Yeah, so our professors and sort of all of my peers, we all collectively agree that primary sources are, if not the most, but one of the most important parts of your paper and your research, because that's where you get all of the evidence that you need to support the claims that you're trying to make. And I personally love working with primary sources because they're kind of the reason why I decided to be a history major, just because I think there's something so special about them. Because I feel like I'm working with actual pieces of history rather than just learning about history through a book. But I know that some of my peers have struggled with specifically the transcribing of primary sources.
Yeah.
A lot of them haven't had a lot of experience with reading cursive or with recognizing those older characters that we don't use today, like specifically the long S's. They look like
yeah.
F's. So
yeah.
it can be very confusing at first, but and plus handwriting is very unique and personal, so you kind of have to get to know your writer a little bit, I guess, before you really can read their writing very smoothly. But I personally love doing the transcriptions, even though it can be difficult to read sometimes because some of the documents haven't been preserved very well, or it can be difficult to read, to see the writing. But the most frustrating part for all of us using the primary sources in our independent research has been just finding the sources that you need to support your claims. And I know that that's part of the research process, and I'm sure every researcher has struggled with this before too. But that's just something that you kind of have to grin and bear, because it's going to happen.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Never give up, and keep looking for material that's on your topic. And I guess, as Mike was saying, you might find some surprising results that you weren't expecting to find when you uncover certain sources. So that's really good.
That is exactly what happened to me when I was using the Colonial America database.
Oh, brilliant, brilliant. Well, thank you so much for that, Kelsey. That's been absolutely great. So thank you for speaking. I'm going to jump straight on now to our next speaker. First of all, just to clear something up, there was a question that came in earlier that I missed about the University of Iowa and socialism on film. Anyone at Iowa has access to that material and that collection. That wasn't something that only Mike had access to. So that's available through the library to everyone, the material that Mike used there. Okay, so following on from Kelsey, we're going to hear from Dr. George Obel about adding primary source research tasks to earlier courses at George Mason, but in particular about the market research and popular culture collections that were added in to a new class there. So, hello, George.
Hi, Ben. How are you?
I'm very well, thanks. How are you?
Fine, thank you.
Excellent. Again, I thought we'd start by having you give a little bit of background to the course. So if you could say something about the structure and design of the HIST 125 course on the modern world and globalization, that would be fantastic.
Sure. So this Introduction to World History course is part of what we call Mason Core, but just read in Gen Ed. It's a Gen Ed course that you know, most of us have taken some courses such as this, whether it's Introduction to U.S. History. It's the big survey courses. And this the survey course is taught by a number of people. There's a lecture component and a recitation component. And my colleague, Dr. Jane Hooper, and I are part of a teaching group where we get together, I don't know, once a month and kind of talk about how we might improve our own teaching. And we had been talking about our mutual frustration in teaching survey courses. I taught more of the U.S. history, and she teaches the global. And we were frustrated because we never feel like it actually represents what we do as historians, and it's not a good gateway course to kind of encourage people to become majors, despite the fact that this is probably one of the last courses in history that many students, undergraduate students, will take. So we started to deconstruct what did we mean by all of this, because we, of course, had included primary sources through readers or pointed to people to online courses or online primary sources, excuse me. And we had done this kind of work before, but it always seemed like the primary sources were out of context. And so part of what we decided to do is we decided we would build a scaffolded class that would have 3 basic assignments that would give students some opportunity to use primary sources in kind of limited ways, and eventually reaching a point where they would be using primary sources and, in fact, developing their own questions to answer these primary sources. And remember, this is a 100-level survey. So in the first lesson, we kind of started at the beginning of this particular course and gave some different travel narratives in the Age of Discovery, you know, Marco Polo being one example of that. And then we asked the students to go to one of our other primary source repositories or some other options to find online maps. So we used ArtStore in this case, but to kind of talk about or have students try to understand how people imagined the world at the time. And then in the second part of the assignment, or the second assignment, which was done a few weeks later, we started talking about slavery, and we wanted them to use two different types of primary sources to try to answer a question, and specifically interpreting images such as runaway slave advertisements and combining that with other kinds of resources such as the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database to try to understand the global commodification of people. And then finally, our third component, we assigned a set of readings that they could select, and we asked them to take a look at two databases that specifically allowed students to look at the rise of global capital consumption and capitalism. And that, of course, is market research and the pop culture in Britain and America databases.
Yeah. Okay, cool. And actually, you've kind of covered my follow-up question, so I'm going to skip past that and go straight into asking you about how the students reacted or responded to this focus, not just on the market research and popular culture, but on the program as a whole and how they got on with those assignments that were focused on these primary source materials.
Sure. So in the first assignments, they had a considerable amount of trouble understanding the context of these particular documents, and so it required a lot of remediation, and that's why we kept the source pool so limited. We wanted to make sure we could help them get the answers to whatever their questions were. But over time, they started to treat it the way that we as historians treat these issues. They started to see these as questions, and they started to develop the skills to try to fill in the blanks that were occurring as they started to read the primary source documents. They then would refer back to secondary sources to try to understand the context of these things. And they were going much farther than they would ever have gone in just a textbook approach, using a textbook with a set of selected primary sources, because they were starting to develop their own questions, and they seemed very engaged then. It was incredible and we actually got feedback from them for the two classes that have been taught, and this is the third time this semester, so we'll get some more feedback. And hopefully Jane and I will do an article sometime where we collect all this data and publish that.
That would be fantastic to see, and it just sounds like it would be really interesting to get that feedback from the students.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Ben. We did ask them what kinds of assessments were most assignments were most helpful, and which module was most helpful, and why. And it's really interesting, the variety of answers. Some actually preferred the first module because it was so tightly defined, and it helped them understand, and they didn't have too many unknowns, whereas a significant number of people love the freedom of developing their own questions and searching these primary source resources to try to help answer those questions.
Yeah. And it sounds like it's good to have that combination across the duration of the course and the assignments. So can you just talk briefly about the ways that the library and the history department cooperated on this? So you said that it was you and a member of the teaching faculty who collaborated to design the course. So I'm guessing that there was kind of constant back and forth between the library and the history department in order to get this to work.
There really was, and I came into their class not to actually teach them anything, to be honest. I didn't do the traditional, this here's your database and this is how you use it, because we wanted to mostly present them with a friendly face and then get them working on projects with the faculty member themselves. And then they were pointed to me as a resource. And surprisingly, even though this is a big population, I wasn't overwhelmed with individual consultations. We did make some modifications after the first time that we taught it, and these last 2 times it seems to be moving along very well. And we are also looking at doing this in other courses. I know I've mentioned to you about maybe doing something on commodities and some other courses, but the faculty and I have been very engaged.
Yeah, that's great. And for those other courses, would the idea be to build in physical as well as digital collections, or is that something that you do already?
Well, we do that in some cases. So, for example, I teach the method. I'm one of the people who teaches the methods course here, and we go, in addition to like database researches, we actually go to our special collections. I give a list of different types of sources such as atlases, manuscript cookbooks, as well as published cookbooks, ship logs, account books, you name it, letters. And I have them all set out on different tables, or my colleagues and I in special collections have them set on all different tables. And we give them a set of questions to go around and talk about the advantages and disadvantages of particular source types. What's the strength and weakness of it? What can't you find out from these sources? But also, of course, what you can. And so we do that on a regular basis. And then I have other assignments, such as a close reading assignment of, say, like a newspaper in the 18th century. And then I have a kind of macro assignment where we look at America's historical imprints and talk about genre as a way to think about topic and subjects. So, I mean, we are doing a lot of different things, but it really depends on what the faculty member wants them to get out of a particular assignment.
That sounds really good. Well, thank you so much for that, George, and thank you for that overview. Just a note to everyone that if you want to hear any more about the digital collections, or if you want to get in touch with me, you can go to the Adam Matthew website or email there. And just to end up now, if anybody's got any questions for George or Kelsey, it would be great to just have 5 minutes to ask them some of those questions. So do type some questions into that Q&A box at the bottom if you've got any. I'd also like to thank everybody for attending today and for listening. It's been really good. Okay, so just the first question here. George, you'll probably know a little bit more about this than Kelsey, but please both feel free to jump in. So in these cases, does the institution have an active archival program? So this is from an archivist who's looking for ways in which archivists, librarians, and faculty can collaborate to do these types of classes. So George, is there an active archival program at George Mason?
Sure, yes, there is. We have an active archival program, and there's an ongoing interest in doing more outreach that expands beyond just traditional history classes. My colleague, for example, in art history, she has worked with our special collections folks where we have different appropriate collections that are more relevant to the courses taught there. Also, some of conflict resolution folks have worked with our archives program. So absolutely, yes.
Okay, that's good. There was a follow-up question there about getting the archivist involved. So it sounds like you've answered that with the special collections folks being involved there. Quick question for Kelsey.
And I'm sorry. I'm just.
No, go on. Yeah.
I always emphasize that the archivists at any of these archives are going to know the collections better than me or better than, most instructors who teach these courses. So they really need to work with those people. Anyway, sorry.
Yeah. No, that's a really good point. Kelsey, a couple of questions for you. So do you think your experience of using primary sources would have been more meaningful or would have made more of an impact if you'd been working with printed sources rather than handwritten material?
I've actually had the chance to work with both.
Oh, sorry to interrupt, Kelsey. There's been a clarification on that question. So rather than thinking about the difference between handwriting and printed, what they're actually interested in is would it have made a difference or more of an impact if you've been looking at the actual physical items rather than the digitized items?
Oh, I think there would be more, I guess, personal excitement to get to actually physically handle the document, just because it's so special to me. But
yeah,
I love the ease and accessibility of the digitized primary sources. It makes it easier to access, and I get to read and look through and actually use like the search functions to sort of filter out, what I want to look at, what I don't want to look at. So there's pros and cons to both. I love paper, but the ease of using the digitized primary sources is amazing.
Yeah. And actually, if I can answer that question a little bit as well, obviously I work with a lot of students, and something that I found is the most excited I see students is at institutions where there is a local archives or the institution itself has a special collections department, and they get to use original physical materials, and that breeds the excitement. But then they also get to go back and use digital collections as well, because that then opens it up to a whole range of material that they would never have had access to in the physical collection. So from my point of view, the best things I ever see always come out of physical collections and digital collections both being used at the same time for the same students and the same courses. Another question for, I guess, both of you. If an archive had lots of untranscribed letters that were in handwriting, do you think it would be an interesting project to have students submit their transcriptions and then have the archivists look through them and use that as a crowdsourcing way to transcribe manuscript material?
I actually have some experience with this. I have an assignment in my methods course where we actually transcribe. I have students transcribe a collection called the Papers of the War Department, which is an online program that's being housed here at George Mason. So they definitely, I don't know if they like the experience, but they certainly appreciate transcribed resources much more after doing that assignment.
That's good. That's good. And then, Kelsey, a question for you. So have you or any of your classmates maybe had experience with primary sources, with current primary sources in medical research? So do you look at medical primary sources kind of coming up to more towards the present day, I guess?
I personally have not, only because my research has been focused just on the American Revolution. But my sister is going to nursing school, if that kind of counts.
Yeah. So has she said anything about her ideas for evaluating primary, secondary, or tertiary sources within a kind of health sciences background? Again, thinking about undergraduate students.
Could you clarify? I'm not exactly sure.
So I don't know how far along she is with her studies, but it's just somebody who's interested in maybe using current primary sources rather than historical primary sources, so looking at current medical studies and how students get on with that. I don't know if it's something that you or any of your friends or your sister have come across. It might not be something that you have, in which case don't worry, but just if it is, it would be interesting to know whether it's something that's happening in the health sciences as well as in humanities and social sciences.
Right. Yeah, I haven't come across any current primary sources for that, but it actually sounds pretty interesting. It could be cool to compare the past to the present.
Yeah.
Maybe for an additional side project.
Just keep giving you new ideas.
I'm always interested.
Okay, well that's really good. I think we are running out of time now, so I'm afraid I'm going to have to wrap it up. And apologies for any questions that we didn't answer. I know a few people have asked about recordings. The webinar has been recorded, and as far as I'm aware, it will be available to view again. That's something that Mark and the Choice team will be sending out a link to. But unless anybody's got anything else to say, I'll pass back to Mark and just say an absolutely massive thank you to our 3 speakers today, and a huge thank you to everyone who's attended and for all of your input and questions as well.
All right, and this is Mark. I'll just jump in and say thank you to you, Ben, and of course to each of our speakers, to Michael and George and Kelsey. I think this is a really great presentation with lots of different perspectives and information. So thank you for your time and your insights. We appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, thank you very much.
Great, and I would just remind everybody that, as Ben said, we did record it, and I will send out a link to the archived version probably sometime tomorrow morning. I'd also point out that we do have a quick 5-question survey, a link to that in the chat box. If you see that there, if you could take a moment to fill that out to let us know what you thought of the presentation and to provide some direct feedback, we would really appreciate it.